Hello, everyone. I hope everyone's having a good Wednesday afternoon. This is a webinar titled From Policy to Practice, what the Department for Education and EU AI Act mean for assessment. Today, I'm really lucky to be joined by two wonderful people, Pat Coates and Gray Mutton. So one quick little update. Simon, unfortunately, has caught a little bug and won't be able to join us. So I thought I'd just start by letting you know what the kind of arrangement of today is going to be. The first thing I'm going to do is just really quickly go through some slides to kind of preempt some components and give a little bit of explanation of key terms that we're going to be often discussing with. Then I'm going to invite my guests to the stage and we'll have a discussion around those points. At that point, please put your questions in the questions tab. And in the chat, the questions area is a little bit easier for us because then we can keep track and you can also vote on particular questions as well. So that's great. And then finally, after we've had that roundtable discussion, there'll be a short demonstration of grade as well. So with that, let's get started. So the first thing I want to start by saying is that it's terminology time. It might be a little bit boring, but I want to make sure that we are all on the same page when we are discussing these topics. Quite often, it can be a little bit intimidating when we are faced with all these particular terms. Some of them are technical, some of them are legal. How do we, interpret these? So let's just go through them. Let's walk through those processes and define them for everyone. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to actually ask three quick questions to the audience just to see where we're at. So the first question is, do we know the difference between generative and classification AI? So that should be on your screen right now. As we're getting those votes in, that's great. So it looks like a pretty reasonable split, around 50-50. That's great. The next question we have is, do we know how AIs learn? So that's a little bit more strongly correlated to a little bit, which is good. Don't worry, I will go through that in a little bit more detail to add a bit more clarity. And then the last question I have is, do we know what training data is? Fantastic. Okay, so we have a nice variety of kind of people in the audience with different levels of background. So don't worry about it. I will go through these terminologies and kind of explain things. So these are the different parts of AI that I think are relatively important when considering policy. So I've highlighted here four particular components: training data, learning, the model, and output. Now you'll notice I've separated this into two components. The first is what we're going to be calling training, and the second is what we're calling usage. Now, during the training process, the output and the desired goal is to create the AI model. Now, we kind of highlighted a component here, which is classification and generative AI. These are different types of models, which I will go into detail in a small moment. But the point of training is to actually be able to create these. Now, ultimately, what we want to do with artificial intelligence systems is to have a kind of set of data for which we want to replicate some component of it. The idea is that there is some relationship between the data that we are trying to replicate. The process of learning is the process of examining that data and examining what particular component you want to replicate. And then the model itself is the system that's designed to replicate things for new data that it hasn't seen. So that's when we get into the usage side. You have input data, which sort of represents the training data, except one key component. It's missing part of the information that we're trying to actually replicate. And then we get the output, which is this desired effect, the idea that you now have the input data plus the thing that you were missing. due to the fact of the model. Now, this is quite an abstract component, so I'm going to go through some examples. So it's time for some examples. Now, when we're talking about training data, I want to emphasize here, this is all about relationships between one or more different components of data, right? And the whole component here is we want to be trying to replicate some part of this information. So the first thing here is we've got images and a description of those images. So we might have a photograph of a puppy, and the description of that could be describing what breed the puppy is, what size it is, what environment it's in. And there is a relationship here between the image and the description. We want to be able to replicate some of this. So we might want to say, take an image and then replicate the description, or take a description and then replicate the image. This is probably starting to sound familiar in terms of what AI systems can do. We might have, say, a set of words and then the words that come after that. So that could be something like a script or a book or a report. The idea being that we want to be able to work out and produce the following words if we know how sentences start. And I guess because we're talking about assessment, we could also have, say, student work and the grades and feedback that it was given. In principle, we can see immediately what value this might have, where if we had student work, we could try to replicate and generate the grades and feedback that was associated with that work. In principle, though, there's nothing stopping you trying to create a system which could take the grades and feedback something was given and generate and create the student work that's associated with it. So remember, with regards to training data, there's always two or more components, and it's the relationship, one of which you are trying to replicate. Now, when we're talking about learning, really the question is, how are we going to examine that particular training data and that relationship? Now, there are a few different ways that we can do this, but I personally like to think about these three because they're quite often the most specific ones that we look at. Now, the first one I'm going to mention is statistics and mathematics. We can use really sophisticated mathematical and statistical techniques to examine that information and be able to interpret patterns that might be difficult to see if we were just looking at the data normally. You can use things like plots and mathematical equations. I won't go into the details of this because it's kind of above the scope of this presentation. But the point here is these are kind of formulaic ways to interpret and examine the data. You can use things like neural networks. Now, these are much more flexible, but the underlying understanding of how these come to decision make is a lot more difficult. You can't really examine why things are happening. At least with statistics and mathematics, you have an understanding of why things are happening. And if you want to have the most full control of understanding how the system is, how the training data is being examined, you can just think about rules. Now, some rules can be really, really simple. You know, if you see a vowel, follow it by a consonant or something like that, or you can be very specific, or like if a particular hex code for a color of a pixel is seen, then we can have a certain rule that comes off out of that as well. The only issue with rules is that they're quite restrictive, and trying to capture the enormity of the data set that you're trying to consider, rules can be quite difficult to do that all prescriptively. And the last part is that model. So if we had, because we've talked about kind of the relationship between two things, the model is designed to fill in the gap for the new data that it hasn't seen based on the stuff that it has seen. So here we've got things like being able to generate stuff, which is text, images, audio, and from text. You could identify things like rogue transactions from credit transactions that you've got. And again, because we're talking about assessment, we can classify grades for particular student work. Now here's the real distinction now that's being shown. So we've talked about the training data, we've talked about how they learn. The difference between classification and generative artificial intelligence is that it's the entire process. Generative AI is designed to create from whole cloth, from very little predisposed information, whereas classification, the gap that's there, is designed to fulfill the gap of finding out the particular grades that are associated with that work, or particular transactions, or any particular classification thing that you might be looking at. Now, another thing we're going to talk a little bit about is risk. So risk is something that comes up in the EU AI Act quite a lot. It's a central premise of it. Now, I personally like to think about risk in the following way. If you have a particular task at hand or a problem that you're trying to solve, the key thing that we'd be looking at is the stakes that are involved when trying to deal with that particular problem. If the stakes are low, having high variability or low risk is almost natural. If the stakes are high, you really want to be using a precision tool because it ends up becoming a high risk activity. So an example of this could be something like making toast. So toast is the worst thing that can go wrong when you make your toast is you burn it and you miss breakfast, and that would make me quite sad. But ultimately, the impact is relatively well controlled, and it's only to me. Now, we could be talking about things like medical diagnosis. We could talk about self-driving cars or assessment. In these cases, the impact that it's going to have on an individual is really high, and naturally, it therefore is a high-risk activity. So with that, I'm going to invite our guests onto the stage, and then we can have this discussion. So today with me, I've got Patrick. Would you want to introduce yourself, Pat?
Hi, I'm here today as the Chief Executive of the E-Assessment Association. We represent organisations like GRADE who are involved in the technology part of assessment.
And we've also got Gray.
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Gray Mitten. I work at NCFE, a technical and vocational awarding organisation in the UK, and I work in our lovely innovation team here at NCFE.
So please remember, if you have questions, please put them in the questions area. So what we're going to do is we're going to break this down into two little sections. The first one is we're going to talk about the DfE. Now, when you examine the key points from the Department for Education, they mention a few things, but these are the 4 things that really are highlighted quite strongly. The first is using AI safely and effectively. The second is using AI responsibly. The third is the components of intellectual property. And the fourth is looking into how to use AI for more formal assessments. So with that, Gray, I'd like to come to you. What key points from the Department for Education have you kind of noticed with your experience?
Yeah, hi. Thanks, Manjinder. I think going back to your point about risk, when we think about work in education using AI, you've got the sort of productivity tools, I guess, that individuals might use to help them do their job faster or to a higher standard, or maybe both of those things, which is fantastic. But the individual is obviously retaining the agency of whatever that work is. And so that, that's relatively low risk. You can kind of, I guess, expect your employees, expect your teachers to understand that they're still responsible, and therefore they're going to do whatever checks and balances they feel they need to. When it comes to anything that sort of starts to automate that, so if we move away from personal productivity, when it starts to automate things, then we have to take a bit of a different view, and then we are talking about high risk activity. And you might sort of automatically, when we're talking about assessment, you might automatically go to, okay, we're talking about sort of summative high stakes assessment. That's obviously high risk, which it is. But there is kind of fairly clear guidelines that actually any assessment within a student's learning journey should be seen as high risk, whether that's a diagnostic at the beginning, whether that's formative assessment designed to progress learning, check learning, plan the next learning activities. All of that formative assessment is high risk as well. So I guess what that means is, in terms of using AI safely and effectively, is that you have to have a whole new set of organizational rules and organizational policy and practice that ensures that people are using it safely and effectively for that purpose. And it's very different from using a personal productivity tool like a Copilot or a Teacher-Matic or that kind of thing.
Absolutely. Pat, and yourselves?
This is quite it's a difficult one, because the problem with any policy that's produced by government, the second you produce it, it's out of date. So it's got to be generic enough to be meaningful, and it's not going to sort of, next week it's going to be finished, but also at the same time it's a little bit fluffy in places. So it's very, very difficult to get that balance. I think we have to acknowledge that AI is here to stay. It's not like, oh well, should we be using it? It's there, it's in the public domain, everybody's using it, whether they're using it on their own volition or they're using it in a work context informally. So I think it's the key part of it is, and I think what came out for me was that it's a great tool and it's there to facilitate teachers and the work that they do. We've got to be a little bit careful, because I sometimes find it frustrating. This is true of high stakes marking as well. We have this naive assumption that everything that we do at the moment is perfect. And it's not. I'm yet to find out any teacher that said, oh, I've got so much time in such small classes, it's such a pain. That's the reality is lots of work, changing curriculum, etc., different needs from different children, large class sizes, everything else. So AI is the perfect opportunity to be able to enable teachers to be able to do their job more effectively. I think the challenge is to say, this is the way that you must do it, because it's going to vary. And again, they do refer to funding and everything else. I think £1 million is mentioned about pilots and that sort of thing. But that's a drop in the ocean. And I think we need to perhaps probably embrace AI more and say, look, it's here to stay. We're going to use it. It doesn't matter if you get things wrong. And I think that's always what, when we teach, when people, not that I'm a teacher, both my parents were, it's all right to get things wrong. And we shouldn't be frightened of being able to say, well, we can try something out. It doesn't work. That doesn't matter. We'll try again and do it a different way. And I think trying to get perfection to the point of, oh, let's not try anything, or let's not, well, let's spend 2 years thinking about it rather than actually trying to do it. So I think that's another key as well about that. So that's sort of a general formative capacity. I wouldn't say formative was high stakes at all. I think it's there to help the students to progress, etc. And what AI is very, very good at is the boring, mundane, tedious, time-consuming jobs that perhaps you don't want a teacher spending their time marking 50 assignments when actually they could be interacting one-to-one with a student, interpreting that assignment. So I think there's more. On a more general note about the high stakes assessment, which is perhaps a little bit out of scope in terms of that, is I think that AI offers huge, I know we spoke about this as well, Manjinder, the other day, it offers a huge opportunity to improve the way that things work. And I think we have to accept that it's here to stay, it can improve things, and we need to embrace it. I think the risk is if we sort of overthink it, we'll still be here in 10 years' time trying to do the same thing. And the other key part about technology is don't just use it to replicate the way you do things at the moment, because that's not, what we need to do is actually to do things a lot better using the technology, what it's good at, in the right possible way, rather than just thinking, let's, replicate our perhaps flawed processes that we have at the moment and do things in a better way with technology. So we also need to think outside the box as well. So I'm hoping that's there within the framework, but my concern of any sort of government policy or policy like that is that by the time they implement it, it's going to be so out of date that it'll be a real challenge to do anything meaningful. So there's a very long answer from me. Sorry about that.
No worries. Absolutely. I want to touch a little bit on this concept of intellectual property. I think naturally, due to the flexibility and variability of these tools, a lot of questions go around kind of the validity of students' use of generative AI with regards to how they're used in formal assessments. But intellectual property is quite an interesting one. So this was specifically highlighted by the Department for Education. Now, in that kind of introduction, I talked about how the training data is used to influence and update and create that model, right? Intellectual property in this case is quite interesting because a lot of generative systems, anything you input into those generative systems and the IP associated with those systems, so like the copyright associated with that, gets then often put directly into the training data. And those implications aren't quite often aware. So in your experience, Gray, how have you kind of seen this intellectual property component come up?
Yeah, we have definitely found this a challenge, this element. And actually, we found it a challenge initially to explain what the problem is or what the problem we're trying to solve. And what I mean by that is, if you start to talk to people about, for example, using previous learner work to train an AI marking model or feedback model, and you start to talk about, problems with using that data, people jump straight to GDPR and straight to your privacy notice and say, oh, it's all right, Gray, we're covered because of this, that, we've got a legal basis for processing, we've got a consent, those kind of standard things that you see in GDPR sort of rules and regs. But actually the intellectual property issue is a different issue, is another issue. So, you can't sort of fall back on your privacy notice, for example. Now, it's a bit of a grey area as far as I'm concerned. We're currently grappling with, if we want to use some learner data to train an AI marking model, what level of permission do we need? What level of opt-out or opt-in should we go for? And actually, from an organization that doesn't have a direct relationship with learners, how do we even obtain this? Is it okay for our customers, our schools and colleges, and training providers to get permission for us? And how far do they have to go down the road of students being able to opt in and opt out? So it's quite a big challenge for us at the moment that we're trying to tackle. I'm really glad it's come up when it has. It's come up in our sort of really early experimental phase with automated or semi-automated marking systems, and we've got an opportunity now to sort of really understand where this lands. And I think if you're sitting there listening to this and you have a direct relationship with learners, so maybe you're a university or school or college or something, a training provider, then you probably can probably solve this problem fairly easily by obtaining that permission from your learners at the point of submission, or maybe even earlier on in the process as you enroll learners or something. But even then, you still have to think about what level of information do I need to provide, what level of transparency, and what level of either opt-in or opt-out. And as soon as you start to think about these things, for example, having an opt-in or opt-out system for your learners' intellectual property, well, then once you do that, you have to then manage that, and you have to make sure that opted out learners' data doesn't appear in your training data. So you have to really carefully think this through before you sort of jump in. But my advice would be, think about it now, because you're absolutely going to want to use that data in the future to train an AI model. I can almost guarantee it. So this is something to definitely think about now, and sort of even if you're not entertaining the use of training an AI model using learner answers or learner homework or learner, from our point of view, it might be a learner portfolio submission, or even a single line answer on an exam paper. That is the learner's intellectual property. So absolutely, cover this off now and get that permission and process in place. Get the sort of the level of transparency, the level of opt-in that you're comfortable with as an organization. So you're sort of set up for the future.
Absolutely. I know Simon's not here, but one component that he really wanted to talk about was understanding what kind of classifies as misuse of artificial intelligence by the students themselves in their particular assignments. Now, luckily, the DfE has actually commented on this directly, and they've kind of worked closely with the Joint Council for Qualifications and actually written a document about this, which we can link on any kind of follow-up information. But in short, kind of the misuse is really kind of to highlight any kind of issues where the student is not really submitting any work that is in their words. The purpose of which is really to ensure that it allows students to develop their own knowledge and their skills and their understanding, and they don't wholly rely on the AI. So the examples that they've got, which I'm reading right now, are things like copying or paraphrasing full sections of responses, or using AI to complete the entire work, failing to acknowledge their usage, or poor acknowledgement, and then submitting work intentionally or with misleading references, which is something that can happen with generative AI. So you might be asking, so how do we actually, how do the students reference and acknowledge that they've actually got some components there too, which is quite useful. So what they recommend is having the students reference the output in a very particular manner. So any components that generative AI has been used to generate anything that's used to help with referencing or help with kind of the work, you should store that in some sort of non-editable format like a screenshot, and then include that within your references as well. And like I said, we'll add a link to this particular document at hand, talking about how it's particularly used. The next thing I want to talk about, of course, this is the second half, is the EU AI Act. Now, it's quite an important act because though it does particularly focus on the EU, quite a lot of other geographies will use this as a kind of launching off point to be able to implement their own AI strategies within their regions as well. Now, if you've had the joy of trying to read all the articles, you'll notice that there are quite a few. There are 113, at least the last time I wrote this presentation. So where do we actually focus? In my opinion, there are 5 things that we really want to be talking about. The rules for classifying whether or not something is a high-risk activity, compliance with those particular requirements, data and data governance, transparency, and human oversight. So, Pat, I know you've done a lot of work on the AI Act. I guess I'll let you take the stage from here.
Yeah, this is always quite a it's a difficult one because again we have spoken before this call, and I sort of tried to sort of condense it down to the key points. And I know that you've got much more detail than I have, but what I tried to do is get it into the high risk category because that's when it applies. So there's lots of other information about other things, and the key about the high risk is whether it leads to anyone's impacts on their employment or career progression or something like that. So obviously examinations do. So my interpretation of that is that it's summative exams, it's not formative, i.e. if it's just providing help and advice and guidance, etc. So anything that is leading to someone's certification or validation of some knowledge, definitely high risk. The other one, of course, is probably related to our industry rather than specifically assessments, is the concept of online proctoring as well. Now, the AA, we did have a session, we had a lawyer on and I was on, and I spoke to them previously before our webinar. And I thought, well, of course, as long as you've got a human in the loop, it doesn't matter. And the lawyer was like, oh, no, any use of AI is. And this is a challenge. We had a discussion about that, and I thought I was right, and he thought he was right. So when actually we know I'm right, obviously, because it's a lawyer's job to come up with something that's like makes it more complex than it is. But the thing is that anything that leads to those high stakes is high risk. It's not saying necessarily you can't do it explicitly, but you can't do it, sort of thing. It's really. The challenge will be is there's no case law. So if someone says, well, that's acceptable, that's not acceptable, no one really knows. So I think that with a lot of this, it's a question of, and I hate using the word common sense, but it is that common sense approach about, have you thought about it? Have you thought of the implications? Have you tried to mitigate the risk associated with it? Have you done things about it? And I think in that situation, I think that's acceptable. Well, though someone else said to me, said, well, actually, you might be better off just saying there isn't a risk and you haven't thought about it, because by thinking what the issues are and trying to mitigate them, you're acknowledging that there is a risk. So this is where it gets, I'm sorry, there's no panacea about a simple answer. But I mean, the big news recently this week has been that Meta have refused to sign to agree to the EU AI Act. But I think that's more about personal data and privacy. And this is going to be the big challenge around anything to do with AI. You've got the big organizations, Google, Microsoft, Amazon, etc., who have a lot of vested interest in AI. You've got the US under the current government, who's also got a huge interest in maintaining the US lead in AI at the exclusion of anything, to be quite frank. They want to be the biggest, the fastest, whatever. And then you've got China on the other side, who are going to be doing the same sort of thing. So I think there's going to end up being a lot of compromises around people and the risk, etc. Certainly from those two, because all they'll care about is being the biggest, the best, or whatever. So I think the EU has a good policy, but it'll be interesting to see how they can implement it, how they can make it. Does that mean that Meta might be banned in the EU if they don't sign up to the Act? You know, potentially that's a real situation that could happen, which of course will have repercussions in a political context as well. So it's huge area, but from our perspective, is it high risk? Does it impact on students? And I would say all high stakes assessments do. So yeah, very much applies to us.
Thank you. Great.
Yeah, I was just going to sort of give you my perception of that EU AI Act, certainly the Section 6 about risk. And the way I read it, it's not necessarily that it's not a task-based thing, so it doesn't kind of rule in or rule out particular activities in the education sector. But what it does highlight is where an activity leads to a decision being made about that person, that's the risky point. So that's where, if that's the case, that's where you might, or that's where you would, sorry, classify something as high risk. And so that, you know, as Pat says, absolutely, that's a summative assessment because you make a decision about the grade and certification, and then potentially the knock-on effects of that for that individual at their next stage in their learning journey or jumping into work. But I think it possibly does apply, sorry, I think, to things like making a decision about what course a learner can do, what level they do it at. You know, these are decisions that get made in, you know, in the sector every day. Even, you know, a decision about how to, I don't mean how to deliver a course, but whether someone is ready for the next stage of their course, that is a decision being made. And so that's what I think puts in a high risk category. And I would sort of suggest that you can do it still. I know Pat said you can't do it. It's really hard to do, of course, because of all the sort of extra additional safeguards that need to be around that decision. But you can do it, but we are talking about extra levels of governance for that system, so that AI system, and extra levels of governance for the data that goes into it. And as well as a whole load of other things that I actually think people in education do anyway, around the monitoring, you know, and the oversight of things, you know. But I think it's those two things, having kind of really clear governance that's documented of your system and your data, allows you access, if you like, to start thinking about, can we automate some of those decisions, or whether we're not quite ready for that, or whether our learners aren't ready for that, and whether we need to maybe take it a step at a time and bring in assistance before we bring in automation.
Yeah, I think that's a really important way to think about it. I want to really quickly highlight some of the other kind of articles that I've written here. Generally speaking, 8 compliance with requirements is a bit tautological. The idea being that the requirements of the article you have to comply with, so you've got to say that you're complying with them. But the data and data governance is quite an interesting one. That particular article specifically focuses about understanding if you're using your data, whether or not you've got the relevant permissions associated with using that data. And if you're not using that data, and you're using a model that's sort of like off the shelf, then you have to understand what data has been put into it. Now, a great question I like to ask, in fact, I will ask it, is, I'm just going to add this. Do we know, where is it? It was still in draft, sorry. Here we go. Do you know what data popular systems like ChatGPT use? So it's about 60-40 at no. Now, a lot of these generative AI tools use things that are quite easily accessible, like the entirety of the internet. Now, you know, if you're going to look at some data and kind of see what happens, and when you create a model that tries to infer the missing gaps, any bias or issues associated with that data are going to be propagated in your model. And as we all know, the internet is a fully bias-free place, right? Of course not. The issues that are associated there will be then propagated in the model that you create. So that's why this particular article is so important with regards to data and the data governance. 13 is the transparency. So if you're using AI in a particular way, you need to tell people what you're doing. Like, you need to be explicit about it. It seems pretty simple, and to be fair, it is. And then Article 14 regarding human oversight. Really, the big thing here is for somebody to be able to understand what's going on, jump in and stop the process if something feels fishy. And that's the real point about the human oversight in this in that particular article. So that is kind of a headline overview of DfE and the EU AI Act. Please, could we put our questions in the questions area? I've got some questions in the chat here, so I'll read those out, and we will go through them. So here we go. So we've got a question here from Richard Nelson, which is, my concern is adding further work for students to do, and sorry, I can't read right now. Let me try that again. So this comment's from Richard Nelson. My concern is adding further work for students to do, and they are unlikely to accurately reference AI use. We are asking them to make a reflective statement on how they have used AI through the assessment. Gray Pat, do we have any comments on that?
I do. The challenge is with, at the moment, I would compare AI, it's a spell checker, it's a grammar checker, it's just something that's so pervasive that you can't say, well, you could say you're not allowed to use it, but that would mean every exam would need to be some sort of invigilated or proctored exam with a lockdown desktop with no access, which if that's the route we want to go down, that's absolutely fine. However, the reality is you can't stop students, and you can't have tools that can check it, because you can say, could you write this as if it was written by a 16-year-old that with an IQ of 110, that what it's pretty good at doing that, so it can't be spotted basically, as long as you take the obvious hyphens that GPT seems to be obsessed about including. But then again, you can set it up so it excludes those. So the problem is that you are not able to say you can't use it. So the problem is you have to accept that it can be used. But do we have to go back to different assessment methods? So yes, you've got the knowledge component, but I think as a point you've made, is more about reflection and about talking, or even talking about it, or having discussions about it, whether it's again with AI or in person, I don't know. But again, we can't just say, oh, look, you can't use it, because the reality is everybody in work's going to use it, because I do every day. It makes me a lot more productive. I can do a lot more than I ever would be able to do without it. So I can't think you can assume people won't have it. It's not easy, but I think you just have to think, how can we use it in a better way? And it's up to the teacher's knowledge of the student to be able to think, well, this is nothing like what they've written, someone else has written this. But then equally, I would also say that don't assume that everything now is perfect. So have you ever heard of children getting someone else to do their homework for them, or people getting dissertations written by one of the organizations that I know in Kenya? There was 30,000 people in Kenya writing dissertations and essays for university students. So again, there's things that have been going on, perhaps malpractice has been going on for a very, very long time. AI is an alternative version of this. So you can't pretend that it didn't happen before and there weren't issues before, but you just got to try and create a framework or an environment where you accept that it is, but you've got to try and minimize it and make sure the students actually getting the the benefit of understanding where things are coming from, why things are the way they are. But my children have been for university, and do I think that their critical thinking and reasoning is as good as mine from when I was a student? I would say certainly not. But then I would say that because the other thing is people are biased as well. So I know the internet is biased. I know the particular it was Grok, wasn't it, which was trained using X data, so therefore was very right wing, offensive, etc., because it was trained by those models. But also, can I just say, people are biased as well. We shouldn't have this again expectation that people are perfect and very, everyone's biased based on their experiences and backgrounds. So AI is the same, and you just have to accept that that is the case. I think you can mitigate it from it, but you can't eradicate it totally. I mean, you mentioned about AI and the training the models, just think of everything on the internet. So obviously typically written by, old heterosexual white males over the last 40 years. And that therefore it's biased because that's the audience. Probably less so in the last 5 to 10 years, but again, life's moving on. I think what is interesting is when AI will be creating its own training models and its own information to train itself. I think was the expression eating your own dog food? I can't remember. There was something about that. That will become a necessity because there literally isn't any more data available anymore to sort of go out. It's all been used. That doesn't mean it can't be used again. But actually, just on that point, when you were talking about students owning the IP to their essays, etc., I get their personal information, but I think it's nonsense to expect that an essay written by a student 5 years ago is their IP. Does anyone really care once they've submitted their exams what happens to it? No one's cared over the last 50 years, so why do we suddenly care now? And I think it's just a bit of a cop-out. I think as long as it's not being used for commercial benefit, or if it is being used for commercial benefit, there's some recompense going to the school or the institution or the organisation. I think it should be, you know, I don't see why it should be not included like that. So anyway, that's a very long answer to a very short question.
There's a question here, well, it's a comment, sorry, from Claudia, talking about, you know, trying to get, you know, a boilerplate plain English explanation for these things for institutions to factor into their communications. Gray, I know you work with lots of different institutions across multiple levels. Kind of what have you seen in your experience there?
I think that's a relatively easy bit of text to write to explain to your learners what your intentions are, and do it in a way that maybe cover things that we don't know yet in the future, you know, new capabilities and so on. I don't think it's too difficult to write the text. What I think is the challenge actually, and sorry, I haven't necessarily seen anything that I would refer to on IP. There's lots about GDPR, but not on IP. So I can't help there. But what I would say the challenge is implementing the system, because in the way that the DfE guidance is written, learners have to be able to opt out, and therefore you have to be able to take their data away, or at least mark it somehow that this data isn't to be used. There's not much point having a system where learners opt out if actually we just use all the data anyway. So yeah, I think the explanation is it's just about it's just an open, honest, transparent piece of text that says what you intend to do with the data. I don't think that's the difficult bit. The difficult bit is implementation. And I would just agree on one point that Pat just made about learner IP. We as an exam board, always going back, you know, however long we can remember, have used the last year's student work to train new examiners and to test new examiners and to make sure that we're comfortable, for example, that they're marking how they should be. And, you know, that's obviously never been said. That's kind of feels like a normal, natural thing to do, you know, totally relevant thing to do. Now that we're talking about AI and a computer system rather than a person, it feels like the expectations have been raised so that, okay, you can train a person to do this job, but you can't train a computer system without the permission. And it does definitely feel like there's a sort of a slight unfairness about that. But in black and white, that is what we're working to at the moment. And I guess it's up to us to keep saying these things and trying to persuade some common sense to prevail, I guess. Yeah,
definitely. Well, I want to thank you both for your time before we move on to the next section. I see there's lots of comments and a really wonderful discussion going on in the chat section. So yeah, please do continue having that conversation. There is an interesting component here, a kind of the broader philosophical components regarding the pedagogical implications of how to best create assessments that use artificial intelligence or let students use artificial intelligence. The guidance itself doesn't explicitly talk about that, which is quite interesting. I think that's something that's going to have to be researched and evidenced and discussed over time, which can be really quite an interesting discussion over time. So thank you, Gray. Thank you, Pat, for your time. And we'll move on to the next section.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So at this point, we're going to move on to kind of talking specifically about assessment. So this is the bit where I get to talk a lot about stuff. So when we're talking specifically about using artificial intelligence in assessment, there are lots of AI approaches. To say that you're going to be doing AI marking is quite a broad concept. So, generally speaking, AI is sort of a catch-all term. So these are kind of 5 different ways that I think are quite an appropriate way to think about different approaches. So the first is kind of this rules-based scoring. So the idea being that somebody who's got a lot of experience writes down lots of rules that a computer could then interpret in some capacity and then apply those rules. Option 2 here is kind of supervised machine learning. So here, if you've got the ability to statistically understand what's going on, you can look at that system and see what's happening and be able to kind of operate and improve that over time. The third is neural networks. These are quite popular, have been popular for the last decade or so. And then the fourth is an interesting one, is fine-tuned large language model. Large language models, in principle, that's your ChatGPTs, your Geminis, and all that sort of stuff. They you can give them a lot of data to kind of put them in the right kind of headspace, basically, so that they can be fine-tuned for a particular task, such as marking. Or you can just use a generative AI system right out the gate with just like an AI mark scheme. So you just give it a mark scheme and then it can do its own interpretation. Now, with such a variety of different techniques for how you could use AI for marking, how do we actually introspect these? So in my opinion, we have to ask the question, what do we actually want from our chosen approach, right? Because there are so many things to consider. Now, I've kind of broken this down here into 3 particular sections. And that's the model or system. That's the area that I was talking about. Now, we've got to be thinking about how that particular model matches to the task, how it's trained, that section that I was talking about, that sampling, and kind of understanding whether or not you can explain what the model is actually doing. You got to actually analyze the output, right? You have this concept of accuracy, which is like whether or not it matched what the human marking did. But that's only one component, right? You've got to care about reliability and stability. So if you put in the same response, do you get the same mark out? What about if you correlate within particular sections or within external tests? And then, of course, you've got fairness and consequences as well. Is there fairness in the training data? Remember how we said that the training data is so important when it's creating those models? Is there a way for you to look at the output and say, is there an explainable answer as to why things are happening? And then you've got to look and check different subgroups to make sure that there aren't any things going on with regards to bias and unfairness. So accuracy itself is surprisingly not really enough when we're thinking about marking in such a high stakes environment. So what I kind of do here is I realize there's a labeling error, but there are 5 things I like to think about here really. Is ultimately, this, if I was to write this in like one simple statement, the marks that are produced should reflect the intentions of the marker. So, they need to be fair, they need to be valid, they need to be reliable, unbiased, and explainable. So if we look at those 5 approaches that I showed before, how do they fit into this kind of framework? So I've created a little table here, right? Are things fully transparent to the experts? Are the decisions based on relevant features? Do you get the same output for the same response? Are you allowed to define what the training data is? How much data is even required to do these things? And where are the biases coming from? Because let's face it, no matter what you do, there will be biases coming from something. And ultimately, supervised machine learning is really the kind of unadulterated winner here. The main reason is because it's fully transparent to experts compared to neural networks or generative AI systems. The relevant features are actually constructed by the designers. So you have full visibility rather than an inference through statistics or this kind of black box understanding through large language models. You get the same output for the same response. Now, this is quite an interesting one. If you put like the same question in, same response from a student, you might not get the same kind of automated grade output through large language model output. You can define that kind of data set as to what's really important. And how much data volume is required, and it can often be quite low. And then the bias sources are quite important here. It's only the data that you put in, which is the human marking, rather than, like I said earlier, the entirety of the internet with these generative AI systems. And this is the bit where I get to be biased, and I say that's why we do what we do. That's what grade actually does. It's kind of a supervised model that only uses that particular data. And I'd like to just quickly show how it works in action for just a couple of minutes. So I'm going to show this in 3 different categories. So the first thing I'm going to do is look at this mathematics question. So remember when we were talking about the data? So the data we have here is the student response, which I've highlighted here fully, and then the feedback is the thing that's being applied. So by directly applying this feedback, I'm annotating and labeling this data, and that's what's being fed into the model. This feedback here is feedback that I've created beforehand just to be a bit more efficient. And you can see, once I've graded a few of these, in this case 6, or I guess, sorry, 8, the AI system has kicked in. So before we were talking about transparency and explainability. Firstly, the data that's being put into the system is only the data that I've put into this from grading this question. So it's only those 8 scripts. With regards to transparency and explainability, the system is very clearly telling you what's an AI suggestion and what isn't. And on top of that, you have this percentage here. This percentage is the confidence level that the AI has that this feedback is correct. And this allows us to kind of have a human in the loop approach. So if I want to, I can just delete this and I can intervene just as required and being fully compliant with all the policies. This system also works for short text. So this is, I'm highlighting some keywords, but in principle, I could highlight entire phrases or sentences. And again, I can pick up the relevant key components of the answer based on the feedback that only I've given for this particular response. And then lastly, here's a simple example of an essay question. This requires a little bit more data, but here we can see different rubric items that have only been trained on this particular response and is able to predict what the score is. So if that's interesting, please do kind of get in touch and chat with us. There's a QR code there, and we'll put a link in the chat as well. I'm more than happy to stay here for the last few minutes and answer questions. But other than that, I want to thank my guests, Pat and Gray, and of course, apologies for Simon as he's been ill. And thank you for all staying here and watching and participating in the discussion. It's been absolutely wonderful. There's a question here from Sarah, which is up to what UK level do you work with schools and institutions for this type of marking? Currently, we work with colleges, training providers, higher education institutions, and some apprenticeship providers. We aren't working with any schools as of this moment, but we're more than happy to have discussions with people who are interested. So a question here, which is, how does grade deal with more flexible criteria when dealing with assessment? For instance, when we're looking for a statement that meets specific criteria. Well, if you want a detailed conversation, we're more than happy to chat. But with regards to this specific thing, you can build rubrics that are for those specific criteria. If it's a very specific thing that you're looking for, maybe like a particular statement that's referencing guidance, you can actually annotate the response itself with that particular component that's being addressed, and then tag it with that one element. And then over time, that will be learnt and suggested. No worries. Thanks, Aaron. Okay, there are around 28 people left in the call, but I just wanted to say thank you again for attending, and I'm going to end the event now. Take care, everyone. Have a great day.